Hi, everybody. Welcome. Happy Wednesday. I have big news. I finally, after almost 4 years, pushed send on my manuscript, and it is off to the publisher. So I'm super excited, having a glass of wine to celebrate. Pour your favorite libation and celebrate with me. I'm so excited. It's going to be great. There's a whole bunch of other things happening in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we get geared up for the marketing piece of it, for getting the book out there. So I've got all kinds of exciting things going on next week. I'm doing a photo shoot for Author Photos, and the cover should be finalized next week, and then we're going to be able to get much more information out to everybody. I wanted to say thanks tonight for Jen joining us to be our moderator this evening. I did want to let you know that Michelle is taking a break right now. She's struggling a bit with a lot of stuff going on in her life, and certainly a lot of additional stress with her chemo treatment. So keep her in your thoughts and prayers, and I'm sure that you will see her again soon. There is a bit to talk about this week in the true crime world. And so I want to talk a bit about Murdaugh, about Adelson, about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, about the Frankie Hildebrand case. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit about the attack on the judge in Las Vegas. So we do have a bit to talk about today. Not sure we'll go the full 2 hours, but we'll give it our best shot. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about Lori Vallow. As you all know, she was extradited from Idaho to Arizona, and she's in jail in Arizona. And the prosecutor had filed a motion with the court to have her case designated as a complex case. What that means is, in Arizona, the prosecutor can ask for additional time if the case is highly complex. First-degree murder cases are always designated as complex, and that does give the prosecution more time in the defendant's speedy trial window. So it lengthens that to 240 days. So the prosecution filed that motion, and the court granted it today. Now, you probably remember that her trial was set for April of next year, same time as Chad's. There was a lot of concern on the part of the prosecutors in Idaho that some of the same witnesses were going to be needed for both trials. So they had already expressed some concern about having the two trials going on at the same time, since they require many of the same witnesses. Sorry, got a little distracted there by the chat. So I thank you, McSpunky. So now they have not yet set a new trial date. I expect it'll be sometime in the fall, but they haven't set a new date for her yet. She is there, and she is in the Maricopa County Jail being held with all other pretrial prisoners who are awaiting trial. There's no chance that she would get bail because she already has a life sentence on the other charges in Idaho. So there's no opportunity for her to get bail and be out at any point. And right now, there aren't any real developments in Chad's case. It appears that they are just working hard on getting ready for trial. I did see a comment having to do with John Pryor asking for additional time to retest some DNA and then opting not to. And the folks felt like maybe that was a stall tactic. Well, I'm certain that John Pryor wants as much time as he can get before he has to try this case, because defendants usually do. Delay usually works on the side of the defense. However, I think that his request was a valid one. They were given DNA reports at the very last minute. And what John Pryor said was, we want the raw data, the DNA profiles that were used to generate the conclusion. Now, this had to do with the hair that was found in the duct tape that wrapped JJ. And the concern was that that couldn't be tested by the local state lab. It had to be tested by a specialty lab called Bodie Industries, I think they're called. And Bodie has a proprietary process where they can test hair that does not have a root attached to it and establish a DNA profile from it. That's fairly new technology, because up until very recently, the only way that you could actually get DNA from a hair was if there were cells, skin cells from the root of the hair still attached to it. So it was very unlikely that John Pryor was going to be able to find somebody else to redo all of that testing, because Bodie Labs really is the only place that's doing that testing. However, what Pryor was asking for was access to the raw data. And he very much wanted access to that raw data so that he could have his DNA expert review it and make sure that Bodie Labs had come to the correct conclusion, or his DNA expert to review it and say, yes, I would have come to the same conclusion based on the raw data. Because there still is a level, an element of interpretation in DNA results. DNA results are very scientific, and in many ways, if it's this, it's not that. However, there are areas that are somewhat subjective and still open to a bit of interpretation. So it is important to have a defense expert review the prosecution's raw data and be able to put their stamp of approval on it, be able to say, yes, given this raw data, I would have come to the same conclusion. So that's what John Pryor was doing. His expert came back and said, I don't think there's any need to retest any of this data. I don't have any questions about how the samples were handled, whether all the proper protocols were followed. I don't have any concerns about how the data was interpreted. I think it's accurate. And it was important for the defense to have the opportunity to do that. Had the judge denied their motion to sever the trials and continue Chad's trial, there wouldn't have been time to do that. And in fact, Lori Vallow's defense didn't do that. They simply used the data that was generated by the prosecution. So I think I don't think that it was untoward on John Pryor's part to conclude that they wanted more information, or that he wanted to be sure that his expert agreed with the data that had been provided by the state. I think that is responsible lawyering, in fact, and zealous advocacy of your client, making sure that all those T's are crossed, all those I's are dotted, so that when that information is presented to the jury, you have the best opportunity to bring up anything that might have been questionable, to poke holes in the state's case. So if John Pryor's expert had said, I've got some real concerns about how these tests were run, whether the protocols were followed, what their conclusion was, then I think it would have been appropriate for John Pryor to be able to cross-examine the state's witnesses about that and to bring his own expert in to refute that testimony. But John Pryor would not have known that if he hadn't done all that background work. So the next case I want to talk about is Murdaugh. You all know Murdaugh has turned into, to call it a circus, sort of derogatory to circuses. It is the strangest, most attenuated, odd case that you can think of. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the case, that'd be crazy to think of, but Alec Murdaugh was a South Carolina lawyer from a long history, family history of South Carolina lawyers, and particularly from solicitors, which are the prosecutors in the area. And he was fourth generation lawyer and solicitor in the county. A very prominent, very influential family with a lot of money. And it turned out he also was a partner in a law firm that did a great deal of personal injury work. And he was often on the winning end of some very large personal injury settlements. So the case developed over a period of time. It started when his youngest son, Paul, took the family boat out while he had been drinking with 5 other friends. Paul was driving the boat while he was drunk. He crashed the boat into a bridge abutment, and very unfortunately, one of the women who was in the boat was fatally injured in the crash. So her family sued for wrongful death. And that began a whole series of events that really triggered this Murdaugh shitstorm, for lack of a better explanation. The attorneys who represented the woman's family wanted all of Alec Murdaugh's financial records. And that is where everything went awry, because it turned out that Alec Murdaugh had been stealing huge sums of money, millions of dollars, from his clients and from his law firm for years. And that all came to light as a result of the financial disclosures that were demanded from in the boat crash. And it prompted him to try a bunch of delaying tactics to try and get people off of his case. And it finally culminated with him murdering his wife and son for the sympathy that it would bring him, and to deflect information, to deflect attention from his financial misdeeds, hoping that he would have enough time to fix everything. Well, it didn't work out that way, and he was he was indicted, tried. Sorry about that. He was indicted, tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He also has pled guilty to a whole laundry list of theft and financial crimes that he has not yet been sentenced on. So after he was convicted in the murders, his attorneys filed an appeal, and it appeared to be taking the normal course of going on to an appeal. Then his attorneys filed a motion asking the appeals court to stay the appellate action, while they challenged his underlying conviction because they believed that the clerk of the court, Becky Hill, had engaged in jury tampering, that she had had inappropriate conversations that could be construed as trying to influence the jury. So now Judge Clifton Newman, who presided over the murder case and who was the person who supervised Becky Hill, has recused himself. The current chief of the court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in South Carolina, has appointed a new judge. Her name is Judge Toll, and she is the former Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. She is one of only 2 women who have ever served on the South Carolina Supreme Court, and the only woman to ever hold the office of Chief Justice. So she has now taken over the case. In the last week or so, we've seen some developments since she's taken over the case. One thing that's happened is that she has directed that all legal filings will go directly to the Supreme Court, that there won't be any, and they'll be filed electronically into the Supreme Court, that they will not go through Colleton County, which is where Clerk of the Court Becky Hill is still located, and where that trial happened. So there's no opportunity for there to be anything untoward happening with any of the legal filings. Now, in general, what happens is the judge starts out by asking, is there sufficient evidence, sort of like a probable cause standard? Is there sufficient information to warrant setting an evidentiary hearing, to take testimony from witnesses about what happened during the jury deliberations or during the jurors? That is actually a second step, because initially the judge often may question jurors in private, may do other investigation, and then determine whether or not there's actually a basis to have an evidentiary hearing. Now, the judge has a pretrial conference set up with all of the lawyers who were involved, coming up, I believe, on the 28th. And then she has set 3 days aside for an evidentiary hearing to begin on the 29th. So it's possible that evidentiary hearing wouldn't happen if the judge were to determine that it's not warranted. But it appears at this point, because she's already set the date, that she anticipates that there's going to be an evidentiary hearing. So that's going to be juicy. And here's why. The initial allegations, first of all, we need to have a little history. Becky Hill is the clerk of the court. She is an elected county official. She's been in that job about 4 years. Before that, she was a court reporter. She's been involved in the county judicial system for quite a while. She worked for other lawyers. She's been involved. Everyone knows her, but she was elected as the clerk of the court about 4 years ago. So fast forward to the Alec Murdaugh case. It's a very small county. It's a small courthouse, much like Fremont County in the Vallow case, maybe not quite that small, but a small town court. And in general, they did a pretty good job. Becky Hill did a pretty good job of organizing, keeping the jury moving, keeping the crowds moving. I mean, people would say she did a pretty good job. However, immediately after the trial was over, within 6 weeks after the trial was over, she published a book. Now, the book was self-published, some kind of hybrid of a vanity press and a self-publishing through Amazon. I don't really know for sure what all the details were of the publication, and it does matter later, so we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll talk about why it matters in a minute. So she entered into an agreement with a guy whose name is I don't know why I can't seem to remember this. His last name is Gordon. Anyway, he is a local journalist, and so they entered into a deal to write this book. So they co-wrote this book. Gordon's wife is a photographer. She also was there and photographed both in the courtroom and outside the courtroom, and was given access in ways that probably other journalists and photographers were not. So initially, the decision was made that there would be a fixed number of journalists who would have guaranteed seating, and that beyond that, it would be first come, first served. However, it became clear really quickly that Miss Becky was answering emails and saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. Just show up at the side door and I'll get you a pass." And so she was handing out special treatment to people that she wanted to give passes to. And she got a great deal of notoriety for being the point person for just about everything that went on in the courthouse during the trial. So once the trial was over, her book comes out, and it hits Amazon, and lots of people buy it. I bought a copy because I was curious. Lots of people buy Miss Becky's book, and then there's some things that start surfacing, such as some, and really at this point, they're kind of rumors that are going around on social media. She's giving tours of the courthouse. She's letting people who make donations go sit in the holding cell behind the courtroom where Alec Murdaugh sat. There are photographs that were taken of Alec Murdaugh in that holding cell as he's waiting for a verdict. And those photos were taken off of a monitor in her office. There's a camera in that holding cell, and the monitor was in her office. So there were a lot of places where things were not 100% kosher. And there was a lot of rumor going around about Miss Becky. Then the next thing we hear is that her son, Jeff, who is the IT manager at the courthouse, because once again, small town nepotism, her son is the IT manager at the courthouse. He gets charged with wiretapping. And everyone thinks, well, why in the world would the IT guy be wiretapping unless there's some connection to Miss Becky? And as law enforcement is investigating the case, lo and behold, they seize Miss Becky's phone, all of her emails, his phone, his emails, official emails. And it becomes evident that this is sort of a bigger thing going on. In the meantime, someone has also made a complaint to the state ethics board, because she's an elected official, about some of her behavior during the trial or surrounding the case. And so the state ethics board is also investigating. So they're also collecting information. And there's an awful lot of these rumors that are starting to get substantiated. One of the interesting things is, so let me drop back. The next thing that happens is that a local news reporter, Will Folks from Fitz News, which is a digital news agency in the area, puts in a Freedom of Information Act request for all of Miss Becky's county emails. And they're documents controlled by the state government or by the county government, and they're subject to FOIA request. So thousands of her emails get turned over to Fitz News. Fitz News, of course, makes them available to everyone. And before you know it, people are combing through Miss Becky's emails. One of the things that comes up first is the fact that while the trial was going on, a BBC reporter, so that's Britain, a BBC reporter wrote an article about the case. She went to email it to someone in the BBC office, her editor in the BBC office, and that editor's first name was Rebecca. So when she hit Rebecca, she accidentally sent that article to Rebecca Hill, the clerk of the court. When she realized what she'd done, she reached out to Becky and said, please delete that. It wasn't meant for you. It was meant for my editor, who's also a Rebecca. And when it automatically populated your name, I just misread it, and please delete that. So Becky Hill said, no problem. Accidents happen. I'll delete it. By the way, it was a great article. Thank you very much. So when Miss Becky's book comes out and Will Folks and his folks start comparing that email with information that was in Becky's book, it's very clear that Becky plagiarized, word for word, copied that BBC reporter's article and used it as the foreword in her book. So the other thing that comes out of those emails is that Becky Hill gave herself, over a period of a year, $15,000 in bonuses that came out of the federal child support funds. So I don't know anything about whether or not that was intended for her to have access to those funds. I don't know enough about it to know, but it does seem a little odd to me that she was giving herself and other members of her staff bonuses out of a child support fund. Interestingly enough, that the amount of money that she gave herself in bonuses was $15,000, which was the amount of money that she contributed to write the book. She and Gordon each contributed $15,000 toward the cost of publishing the book. So I think it's just kind of interesting that that those amounts sort of line up. So now Miss Becky is subject to a state ethics investigation. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, which is their state police, are also investigating Becky. They've confirmed today, maybe it was yesterday, that they in fact have opened 2 separate open investigations into Miss Becky. So here's the issue. Does any of that, even if all of that is true, if she plagiarized her book, if she took money, if she gave tours and solicited donations for them, if all of those things are true, if she gave preferential treatment to people in the trial, even if all of that is true, it doesn't prove jury tampering. It doesn't prove that she in any way tried to influence the jury. So a lot of people are going, oh, you know, they're just throwing Miss Becky under the bus. And none of it has anything to do with impacting Alec Murdaugh's case. But here's where it does impact. If the judge decides to have an evidentiary hearing, undoubtedly she will have to be called as a witness. One of two things is going to happen. Either she is going to invoke the Fifth Amendment, and or she's going to have to answer questions. Regardless, the defense has the right to bring in all of that information to prove that she's not trustworthy. And we've talked before about the fact that your bad acts outside of the case that you're being questioned on can be brought in to impeach your credibility, to say, look, this person's just not honest. And there's a lot of proof racking up right now that Miss Becky hasn't been honest. She admitted to the plagiarism to her co-author, who promptly then announced it to everyone and asked Amazon to take down the book. Here's the interesting thing. Self-published books are usually print-on-demand books. So Amazon has a system where they can print books as they're ordered. However, when Amazon started getting the orders started flying in right after the trial, as soon as the book was announced, Amazon started getting lots of orders. And Amazon couldn't keep up with their print on demand couldn't keep up. So Amazon opted to print a limited run so they would have books on hand to ship out. Well, the publisher, the author publisher said, I want to take the book down, Mr. Gordon, because it has plagiarized material in it. Amazon said, not so fast. We paid to have all those, that run of books done so that we would have it on hand. And so we're entitled to sell the books until those are gone. So interestingly enough, since Gordon said that he wanted to stop selling the book and remove it from having access, 900 copies have been sold. And so that's going to help Amazon work their way out of the hole that they were in because they printed too many. But what do you do with the proceeds? So Gordon has said that he is going to donate the proceeds, and that he will not in any way profit off of someone else's work. Now, he and Miss Becky have both formally apologized to the BBC reporter and to the BBC, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit more push and shove coming when it comes to whether or not they owe the BBC anything. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. So we do know that Miss Becky, we do know that there's going to be a hearing. We know that there's going to be, that there may very well be an evidentiary hearing. It's going to be at the end of the month. And we will definitely be keeping an eye on that. Because Alec Murdaugh is asking for a new trial. Now, one of the biggest, I think, reasons why they want a new trial is this. During Alec's trial, Jim Griffin, the grifter as I call him, made a mistake. In evidentiary rules, under the evidence rules, you can only bring in evidence of a person's prior bad acts in certain circumstances. So the defense had asked Judge Newman to issue a motion or a limiting order. They filed a motion in limine. You hear that all the time. And the judge had issued a limiting order on what they could and could not bring in at the trial. They did the same thing in the Vallow case, having to do with Charles Vallow and his murder. They were limited on what they could say. They couldn't say Lori had been charged with Charles' murder. There were other things that they couldn't reveal. So they asked for a limiting instruction, and Judge Newman issued a limiting instruction as to how much of Alec Murdaugh's financial crimes could come in. So some did come in under the order, under the limiting order. There was some information that could come out. However, Jim Griffin had a young man on the stand, and I'd have to look up in my notes to find his name, but he was a friend of Paul Murdaugh's, one of the murder victims, Alec's son. He was a good friend of Paul's. And Jim Griffin did what's called opening the door. So in a case where you have, even with a limiting instruction, if the other side opens the door on that line of questions, then the limiting instruction gets thrown out and you get carte blanche to ask whatever you want. And that's what happened with Jim Griffin. He started to ask that young man about the relationship that Alec had with Paul and how that was, and if he'd ever seen any problems among them, and if he'd ever so Creighton Waters got up and said, "How much do you know about Alec Murdaugh's financial situation?" The kid said, "Well, I don't know anything about that." And but you didn't see any conflict, right? Nope, didn't see any conflict, didn't see any, and all that really did was open the door for then the prosecution to walk right through and say, "Let me tell you what was really going on. Let me tell you about all the financial crimes." And Judge Newman then you'll remember that they wanted to make a proffer, and they wanted to essentially preview what the witnesses were going to say. So they did a whole day and a half worth of taking testimony outside the presence of the jury, to establish what the evidence they were going to offer. And then they presented it to the jury. So we all got to see it twice. So they really want a new trial because they want to go back and undo all that. They get a chance to unring that bell if they get a new trial. It's a big if. But the fact that Miss Becky has become so suspect, and her level of honesty sort of tips in the direction of, "Miss Becky, how can we believe you when you come to court and say, I didn't say anything wrong to the jurors? The only thing I asked them about was, do you want lunch? What do you want for lunch? You can have a smoke break," administrative sorts of things. Now, there's a difference of opinion between the prosecution and the defense about what the legal standard is. How do you decide that? So the prosecution says you only get there if you can actually prove that a juror was influenced by something that was said by Miss Becky. The defense says, "Oh, no. All you have to do is prove that the statements were made and that it's possible they weren't harmless." So there's a huge difference in the legal standard that the judge would need to use to decide whether or not there'd been jury tampering. The first thing the judge is going to have to do is decide what the legal standard is. And that is all in the case law. Both sides recently submitted lengthy memorandums, which are essentially their legal argument, all the cases they cite, all the reasons why. And they're given to the judge in advance, so the judge can be sure that she has read all of those cases, understands, has done her own research and her own analysis, so that she can do a good and wise job of assessing all of the evidence that will come in an evidentiary hearing. So the first thing she's got to do is decide what the legal standard is going to be. What is the rule that she's going to hold all this evidence against and decide on? So the prosecution says you only get an evidentiary hearing if you can show that there's been actual prejudice. And the defense says, oh, no, you only have to prove that a juror could have been influenced by it. So that's a huge difference. Once the judge determines what the legal standard is going to be, then she's going to have to weigh all that evidence and decide whether or not there was actual tampering with the jury and whether or not it was intended to change the jury's mind. So that will be interesting and exciting to watch for those of us who are legal wonks who love getting down in the weeds and reading all the statutes and doing all those things. I think it will be really interesting. So we're going to be covering that pretty closely when it comes up at the end of the month. A few minor things have come up in the Adelson case. As you know, Charlie Adelson, I'm not going to do a recap on the Adelson case. We'd be here for the rest of the night, but it was a murder for hire case. The two gunmen were convicted. The woman who was the go-between, who set it all up, was convicted. Charlie Adelson, who was the brother, was convicted. And now the prosecution is sort of knocking the pins down because the whole thing was set up because Wendy Adelson, who was the sister, was divorcing her law professor husband, and they were arguing over child custody. And Grandma Donna wanted her grandsons back down in South Florida and not up in the sticks in Tallahassee, where they had been living. And so when Professor Markel, who was the victim, wouldn't agree to have the children move to South Florida, which is like 6 or 7 hours away by car from where he was living, Charlie Adelson arranged to have him murdered, and he was murdered in his own driveway. The case went unsolved for a couple of years, and then it has taken 4 or 5 years to finally get all these convictions. But at the heart of it is matriarch Mama, Donna Adelson, who there's another creator who calls her Mama Gotti from the crime family. She really has been the person who everyone believes influenced Charlie to do all this. She participated. She's the one who provided the cash. And so very interestingly, a week after Charlie Adelson was convicted and he was sentenced, she and her husband, Harvey, booked a one-way ticket to Vietnam, which conveniently does not have an extradition treaty. And she was literally in the jetway getting on the airplane when she was arrested. And she has been in jail. She was arrested at the Miami airport. She was then transferred to the bane of her existence, Tallahassee, because that's where the crimes occurred. So she is now being held in the Tallahassee jail. She originally had a Miami lawyer, woman lawyer, Marika Descalzo was her name. She made a couple of appearances. It was very clear that she is not a state criminal attorney. I'd read on her website that most of what she does is federal criminal defense, and the systems are pretty different. So she was a little bit out of her depth. So not surprisingly, Donna Adelson has new lawyers. Interestingly enough, she has substituted in Dan Roshbaum, who was her son Charlie's lawyer. A lot of people were critical of Roshbaum, but I have to say this. I think he did a very good job. He's a good trial lawyer. And I think he did a very good job with a shit case. I'm sorry, but that the facts are bad. The evidence against them's terrible. There's all sorts of, they went out and got a wiretap, and there are hundreds of hours of wiretap phone calls between Donna and Charlie and Katie Magbanowa, the middle woman, and I'm on and on it goes. So he had a tough mountain to climb. I don't think there was a lot of chance that Charlie was going to get exonerated, except in Charlie's mind. So unfortunately, it didn't happen. And now Daniel Roshbaum, and it makes a certain amount of sense. The Adelsons have known Dan Roshbaum for quite a while. He's been Charlie's attorney for quite some time. I think at one point he actually was Donna's attorney as well. And they know him and they trust him. They have also wisely brought in associated a Tallahassee attorney. And that is a really wise move. When Daniel Roshbaum tried Charlie Adelson's case, he was an out-of-town lawyer showing up in Tallahassee, and they hired a jury consultant from New York, which was crazy because the jury consultant from New York had absolutely no idea how to deal with jurors in Tallahassee. I mean, just things as simple as if you live in a community, you know what part of town people live in. Do they live in the upscale part of town? Do they live in the barrio neighborhoods? And you know that because you're familiar with the community. So I think it was a really smart move on Roshbaum's part to bring in a defender from Tallahassee. There's been some discussion about the fact that this lawyer often does court-appointed work and may very well be a court-appointed defender. I don't know, and the point was made, we don't know what Donna did. We know that before she decided to leave for Vietnam, she told Charlie on some recorded jail phone calls that she was setting things up for her grandkids. She was basically putting all of their money in trust. We don't know what that looks like, whether or not all her money is now tied up in some kind of irrevocable trust. So we don't know. It's possible that she doesn't have access to her money, to her and Harvey's money. So the only one who is still sort of hanging out there is Wendy, because there's always been discussion about whether or not Wendy knew either before or after what the plan was. So it seems as if the prosecutors are being very methodical and just picking these defendants off one by one. And Wendy Adelson has testified in all those other trials under an immunity deal. So interesting to see what the next development will be. I would not be surprised to see Wendy arrested, although I think the evidence that they have against her is less compelling and a little bit more circumstantial, but in a way that's a little distant. It's not as cut and dried, if you will. So I want to talk about a couple of other cases, and then I want to wrap up by talking about Gypsy Rose Blanchard. So a couple of other things have happened recently in the last week. One being that you all know that Jody Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke both pled guilty. Ruby Franke is the mom blogger from Utah, the LDS mom blogger, who got very popular talking about raising a big family. Her parenting techniques were a little questionable. Her form of discipline seemed pretty harsh. She and her husband hit a bad patch, and she was referred to a therapist, Jody Hildebrand. Jody Hildebrand turned out to be a fairly unethical and unscrupulous therapist who insisted that Ruby distance herself and isolate her husband, who was until he repented. And in the meantime, she and Ruby Hildebrand started an online business offering coaching and parenting advice. And what Ruby Franke brought to the table was a couple million viewers from her YouTube channel. So Kevin Franke, the husband, didn't have much contact with his children. He wasn't allowed to have contact with Ruby, didn't really understand what was going on. And then one afternoon, the neighbor next door to Ruby or Jody Hildebrand's home got a knock on the door, and standing at his door was a 12-year-old boy, still with duct tape around his ankles and his wrists, covered in bruises, scratches, scabs, clearly malnourished, and asking the man to call the police. It turned out that was Ruby Franke's 12-year-old son. He had been being held as a form of discipline in Jody Hildebrand's basement, along with his 9-year-old sister. The police came, the children were rescued. The other Franke children were removed from Ruby's care. They were all arrested. And last week, they both pled guilty to very serious child abuse charges. Each of them pled guilty to 4 of 6 counts of, I believe that's right, of very serious child abuse. And those charges carry a maximum sentence of 15 years apiece. They agreed that their sentencing would be consecutive. As part of the plea deal, they agreed that their sentencing would be consecutive. So one after the other, rather than all running at the same time. So then now there's question about how much jail time they're going to get. Their sentencings are coming up at the end of the month. I'll have to look that up. I think it might be mid-February, actually, 18th, I think. Anyway, one person who has spoken out very widely is a person whose name is Jesse Hildebrand. They use they pronouns, and I'm trying to get better at honoring those things. Jesse Hildebrand is Jody Hildebrand's niece. And at one point, Jesse was left in Jody Hildebrand's care for an extended period of time because her parents thought she was out of control. And Jody Hildebrand used many of the same punishments and the same kinds of abusive techniques on Jesse as she did on Ruby Franke's children. And Jesse Hildebrand has been very open about discussing their experience. That definitely brought into focus what probably was happening to Ruby's children. And it was serious child abuse. The details are out there in their plea petitions. A lot of creators have sort of avoided getting deeply into the details. I'm not going to get deeply into the details because I think at this point it doesn't really matter. They have agreed to be, both Jody and Ruby have agreed to be sentenced for the crimes that they pled guilty to and to serve consecutive sentences. But here is the little wrinkle. Jesse Hildebrand recently announced that they had talked to the district attorney and that the district attorney had told them that Jody and Ruby could expect to get the maximum sentence, which it's a little unclear whether Jesse concluded that would mean 4 consecutive 15-year sentences or whether the district attorney said that. But in Utah, there is a cap on maximum sentences at 30 years. So even if a judge were to impose 4 consecutive 15-year sentences, the maximum that they actually could serve would be 30 years. So there's a bit of confusion about that. I have not taken the time to dig into the statute and figure it all out, but I was listening to the lawyer, and he did. So there is an episode, his most recent live does dig into the statute and reads the statute and explains in the weeds the reason why he thinks it's more likely that they'll each get 30 years. Either way, it really is going to be the rest of their lives that they're going to be in prison. If they get out at all, it'll be when they're very old. I have said from the beginning that I believed that that the judge would at least sentence Ruby and probably Jody as well. It's very clear from Ruby's proffer and through her attorney, her plea proffer, that she felt manipulated by Jody. And it was very clear that Ruby intended to throw Jody under the bus. So it made sense that perhaps Jody might get a longer sentence. But I felt from the beginning that at a minimum, the judge was going to impose sentences that would assure that all of Ruby's children were well into adulthood by the time either were released. So what we know now is that that the maximum sentence, unless there is some provision of Utah law that we're unaware of, the maximum sentence would be 30 years. So, and finally, I wanted to talk about the case in Nevada having to do with the guy who vaulted over the bench and attacked the judge. I had to tell you, I think that judge was a badass because, and you have to give her court clerk and her courtroom deputies huge respect. Kudos to both of them. The clerk, her male court clerk that was sitting next to her, dove in to put himself in between the judge and the defendant that did the high jump over the bench. And the court security, they were able to pull the guy off the judge. She fell back and hit her head and had to go to the hospital and get checked out, and had some bruises and some aches and pains, but was okay. They were able to pull the guy off of her. For those of you who've seen the footage, it is the clerk and the court security trying to subdue this guy, and he is like almost superhuman. The court security guy ended up with a big laceration across his forehead and a concussion and a dislocated or separated shoulder. So it was an ugly fight, and it could have been way worse than it was. I heard an interview a day or so ago that Nevada is certainly taking a hard look. The state in general, the state court administrator as well as the local court administrators are taking a very hard look at security assessments and changing things up. So those are the kind of interesting cases. But what I thought was really commendable on the part of the judge was she went back to work the next day. And that defendant was brought back into her courtroom in all kinds of restraint, in a spit mask, where she then sentenced him to the sentence that she was imposing at the time that he decided to take the leap across the bench. She made clear the point that the charges that arose out of the incident in the courtroom be handled by a different judge, that she would not be handling those charges. But she did get back on the horse, look the guy in the eye and say, here's your prison sentence, because he was there pleading for another probationary sentence, and he has a terrible record. And she said, I think it's time you get a taste of something else, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. And that's when he lost his composure and vaulted over the bench. I mean, it was almost superhuman. And so huge commendations to the folks who were there to put themselves in between him and the judge. And kudos to the judge. She's a badass. So, and finally, I want to talk about Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Now, this is a case you may not have been familiar with, although it's been out there in social media land and in true crime land for a long time. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, as a very young child, her mother decided that she was ill. Her mother was mentally ill with what has been called Munchausen by proxy. It's not a common mental health diagnosis. What it means is Munchausen is usually someone who inflicts injury or pain on themselves to get attention, usually from medical providers. So they make themselves look sick, or they give themselves an infection, or they pose these chronic conditions to try and get attention from doctors. Munchausen by proxy is slightly different. It's a little more nuanced, because it's usually a parent who makes their child look ill in order to get attention from medical providers and get attention from people who say, oh my gosh, you're such a brave mom taking care of this poor sick child. And so that's what was happening with Gypsy Rose. From the time she was somewhere around 4 or 5 years old, her mother began saying, oh, she's sick, she can't walk, she has to be in a wheelchair. She insisted that she had muscular dystrophy, that she had leukemia, that she had other forms of cancer, that she had poor eyesight, that she needed hearing aids. And in the process of all of this poor girl grew up receiving medical treatment that she did not need, because she was perfectly healthy. And she grew up being told that she had to stay in her wheelchair, that she was not able to do things, to the extent that her mother convinced doctors to perform unnecessary surgeries on her, including surgeries to remove all her salivary glands and a surgery to insert an unnecessary feeding tube. This is beyond abuse, and the emotional and the physical abuse that Gypsy experienced was horrendous. And her mother, as a result of all of this, reaped a lot of benefits. They got disability. They got wishes through Make-A-Wish Foundation. They got a Habitat for Humanity home. They were given all sorts of They were constantly getting donations. They were being invited to things, and Gypsy became sort of of an ambassador. You know, I don't want to say poster child, but sort of an ambassador for childhood illnesses, and whenever doctors would get a little suspicious, then Gypsy's mom, Dee Dee, would move. So after they moved and got this Habitat for Humanity house, Dee Dee didn't want to move anymore. So she began telling doctors that all of Gypsy Rose's prior medical records had been destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, and that there was no way to access any of her medical records. So the only person that they had to get it, the only way they got information about Gypsy's medical history was through her mother, who was an extremely unreliable and dishonest reporter. As Gypsy got older, the other thing that Gypsy's mother did was, because she claimed that everything had been destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, she got a new birth certificate for Gypsy that showed she was 5 years younger than she really was. So she had Gypsy convinced that she was younger than she really was. She had Gypsy convinced that she was of diminished mental capacity and would never be able to live on her own. She had Gypsy convinced that she was a dying young girl. But as time went on and Gypsy got older and had a little bit more access to the outside world, such as the internet, she began to understand that something wasn't right. And at some point, she started communicating with people outside of her house and her mother and the people that her mother approved, including a guy that she met online. And after a couple of years of this secret relationship going on between Gypsy and Nicholas, they started saying, well, we want to be together. And Gypsy's mother had said, you can never get married. You can never have children. You can never have a boyfriend because you're too sick and you don't have the mental capacity. And so she had told Gypsy, you're never going to do any of those things. And I'm going to dress you up like a Disney princess for the rest of your life because that's how I get attention from people. So I think so what happened was they hatched a series of plans. One was for Gypsy to run away. Gypsy did try and run away. Her mother got her back. And then life was even more difficult. She withheld food. She chained her to the bed. It was harder. And Gypsy learned quickly that her mother was that powerful. So the other alternative they came up with was to kill Gypsy's mother, Dee Dee. And the boyfriend came. Gypsy was able to obtain money. Mom had money around the house frequently. And so Gypsy took money from her mother and sent it to the boyfriend. He took a bus and came to town, and they planned the murder. Gypsy actually locked herself in the bathroom, and he stabbed her mother to death. They then disappeared. They went to his family, which was in a different town, and eventually police caught up with both of them, and they were both arrested. When police confronted Gypsy, she admitted what they had done, and the more that police interviewed her, the more they realized that she really was a victim, a long-term abuse victim. She also agreed to testify against her co-defendant boyfriend. Now, she testified against him. He was convicted and received a sentence of life in prison without parole. Gypsy, on the other hand, was given a 10-year sentence with the possibility of parole. From all indications, Gypsy has been a model prisoner and has done a lot of introspection, and she was up for parole and was paroled last week. She was released from prison, and there have been multiple documentaries made about Gypsy, about her life, about the case, and she's big news. So when she was released, she had met a fellow that she was corresponding with in prison. They got engaged. They actually got married while she was still in prison. She was released. She has been doing, just before she was released, Lifetime did a documentary series on Gypsy Rose from Prison Confessions, I think it's called. And that has been running this week. So she has been out doing promotional tours for this documentary series. She's been in New York, and she's been getting to know her husband. And I mean, a lot of people have had a lot of opinions about it. A lot of people feel that she's cashing in. And I can't disagree. But I also think that you have to remember that her emotional development and maturity lags behind the average 30-year-old adult. In many ways, she stopped her development when her mother started putting her through all of that terrible stuff. She did finally really discover that she wasn't sick and that her mother was doing this, and did begin to understand that it was not her, it was her mother, but in a kind of skewed way. And I think that a lot of people have been really quick to jump to the conclusion that she should have been as culpable as the boyfriend. I don't entirely disagree, but I do understand why the system treated her differently. Ultimately, she was a victim of her mother, and she did testify against the guy who actually committed the murder. So a lot of people have said, well, she manipulated him, and that may very well be true, because now his lawyers are trying to get him a new trial. And what they're saying is that he was of diminished capacity. She was much smarter than he was. She manipulated him, and he is autistic and intellectually challenged, and that his first attorneys didn't present that defense, and so there's an ineffective assistance of counsel argument that his current attorneys are bringing, saying that his prior attorneys were ineffective, that they should have raised the diminished capacity defense, and because they didn't, he should get a new trial. So I think one creator and commenter made the remark, we have to separate her abuse from her actions and her choices. I'm not really sure that's possible. I represented many, many people during my career as a public defender. The last few years, I did almost exclusively juvenile work. So I represented almost exclusively juvenile defendants. And I represented some people in some pretty serious cases, including attempted murder of a parent. And so maybe I have a different perspective, but all of the literature that we see from mental health professionals is that young offenders are some of the easiest to rehabilitate. They are the people who are most likely to be rehabilitated. I mean, they don't all get rehabilitated. I have some stories, but it is true that there's a better chance of rehabilitating a young person, a minor, than there is someone who is in their, whose frontal lobe has finished developing and who is an adult. So I think they both should have gotten more lenient sentences. The boyfriend, because of his diminished capacity and his age. Gypsy, because of her diminished capacity, because of the abuse. And I don't think you can separate those things. A very learned creator is waving the bullshit flag and saying she needs to be held accountable. You know, I don't disagree that she needs to be held accountable. I hope that she is getting and taking guidance and direction from people who she can trust. I hope that she is getting the kind of mental health help and the kind of guidance from people who really have her best interests at heart. That is the piece I'm not sure of. We have a guy who is a 6th grade social studies teacher who becomes her pen pal and marries her when she is still in jail. She is a high profile, well-known defendant. He contacted her because he had seen one of the documentaries about her. So I have concerns about that. I have questions about that. I have misgivings about that. Because I don't want to see a situation where someone is taking advantage of Gypsy because she is so vulnerable. And I think she is horribly vulnerable right now. She's saying all the right things. I'm taking responsibility for what I did. I want to raise awareness. I want people to understand my side of the story. I want to be an advocate. I mean, she's saying all the right things. The question is she able to gauge the sincerity of the people around her? And is she able to know and understand who to trust? Is she able to make those judgments? Or does she have people in her corner who she trusts that are willing to help her with that? That is going to be crucial. I know that her father and her stepmother have continued to be very involved with her throughout the time she was in prison. I hope that she is getting the kind of support and the kind of advice that can help her move along. I think one of the things that's very obvious from the interviews that she's done is that she has the capacity. She's smart. She has the mental capacity. The question is whether or not she's able to have enough personal insight and enough ability to form her own opinions, that she's able to do that or have people help her with that. I absolutely believe that she is a victim. I absolutely believe that the sentence that she served was appropriate. If anything, I think the sentence that her co-defendant, Nick Godejohn, is serving is the one that is excessive. I know that that is not an opinion that's shared by everybody, but it's my opinion. It's my opinion based on the years of experience that I've had with people, maybe not just like Gypsy, but in similar circumstances. Kids who grow up in abuse, extreme neglect, those sorts of situations. And so I feel like I have a basis to defend my opinion. But I fully acknowledge that there are other people who don't share that opinion. Scott Reich, he says enough with Gypsy. She's just cashing in on what happened to her, and I don't want to talk about her, and I don't want to, you know. And there are other people out there who feel similarly, who feel like she was not sufficiently accountable for what occurred. But I think that unless you have been in those kind of abusive situations and you understand the power dynamic in those situations, I think it's difficult to judge. I had life experiences that give me the ability to understand what that feels like to be in that person's shoes. And I believe wholeheartedly that unless you have been there and you understand what that power differential is, that inequality in the level of power, you can't really understand it. I mean, time after time, people say, why did that woman stay when her partner was abusive? Why didn't that kid tell on their parent? Why didn't she just stand up? And I just think that was asking more than at that time she had the capacity for. She freely agrees that she freely admits and agrees that she made the wrong choice. That she regrets it deeply, and that if she had it to do over again, she certainly would have made a different choice. But she also says that in that moment, she felt there was no other way to get out of that situation. And that does not surprise me. I think that that's probably valid and true, that she did in that moment believe that that was the only way to escape that horrible situation. It's very common that a person who's being abused thinks their abuser is all powerful, that they know where they are, they can find them, they'll show up. You know, people who've been abused and have trauma often become extremely paranoid about, oh my gosh, they're driving by my house. Do they know where I live? How did they find out where I live? They see a car similar to the one their abuser drove 5 years ago and jump to the conclusion he's outside my house. I've had those clients, and it happens because that abuse starts small. It becomes more and more serious. It's very incremental. And with every incremental increase, there is also an increase in the power, the control that they wield over their victim. So suddenly it's, if I leave, he'll find me. If I leave, they'll know. And there was some proof of that in Gypsy's mind, because she had run away and her mother had found her and had brought her back. And when she had tried to tell somebody that this abuse was happening, people didn't believe her. So mom had all the power because everybody believed her. So it's important to remember that when there's that incredible imbalance in power, I can understand how Gypsy would say, in that moment, I believed with everything I was that that was the only alternative. Now, with the value of hindsight, and I hope therapy and all of those things, I now realize that I had many other alternatives. I just didn't then. I didn't see it. I had my little victim blinders on that my mom put on me, that restricted me from being able to see what was really going on. And had I not had those on, I probably would have been able to reason my way out of some other alternative besides killing her mother. So I realize that reasonable minds can differ, and we do. What I love about our community and our chat is that we do it with kindness and with recognition that we're all smart people here and that we all come to this chat with our own life experiences that color how we look at things. And that the way that we all learn is to exchange ideas. And I can change my mind. And I'm open to hearing what other people have to say. So I just saw something come up in the chat that said CPSD, that's complex PTSD. And I think that that's probably a very accurate diagnosis for Gypsy. I think that she has been through things that no human should have to be subjected to. And I think that as a result, her emotional maturity is stunted. And I am hoping and saying a little prayer for her that she has the right people around her who can help her chart an adult course that will be healthy and safe and sensible and surrounded by people that she can trust. And that's hard. It's hard. You know, one of the things that we work hard to teach our children when they're growing up is how to truth test, how to measure whether someone's telling the truth, whether you can trust them. I mean, that's a skill that we hope and we work hard to teach our children. We teach our kids to be honest about things, but we also teach them that not everybody in the world is honest, and how we test other people and their motives and their honesty. And it's easy to see how Gypsy could be lagging in those skills, those protective skills that will protect her from those kind of those people whose intentions maybe aren't as pure as they should be. So I want to thank all of you, and we're going to take some questions. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Please hit the notification bell and subscribe, and please hit the thumbs up, because it really does assist in the algorithm, really does help us show up more on YouTube. And I want to say thank you, because y'all have been hanging in there with me for more than a year now, as we've built this community and as I wrote a book about the Vallow Daybell case. And the book is in its final stages. It's not in its final form because there's some really smart people at Pegasus Publishing who are going to take a look at it and help me tweak it and help make it the very best that we can make it. But the bulk of the work's been done. We are going to be doing some updates after Chad's trial. So the final couple chapters are going to be written after Chad's trial is done. But for now, it is launched. It's kind of like it's on its sea trials. It's out there and it's being launched. And I'm really proud of it. I'm really proud of the community we built here. I'm also really proud of the way that you all have shown up and how much I enjoy this community. So now some of we shift gears and new work begins, promoting the book and getting it out there so people know it's out there. But I also want to thank you for your patience, because sometimes things don't happen on schedule the way that they are supposed to. For one, this quilt back here, and how long it took us to get the drawing done, and how long it has taken me to get the quilt sent out to the lovely Kathy Watson. So it is still hanging behind my wall, behind my head here. I actually need to dig out a new quilt to put up behind me. And but I am going to do my very best to get it out to Kathy this next week. And I want to thank everybody who bought a raffle ticket and donated. We raised about $500 that's going to go to the Centers for Missing and Exploited Children. And I'm excited to be able to do that as well. So we're going to send that check off next week. And I will certainly include a picture of the quilt and information about this terrific community to share with everybody. So I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. And with that, let's take a few questions. I know Jen has been, I see her marking them with stars as we're going up. So I know she's got some to post. And in the meantime, cheers. Hi. Hi, Jennifer. Well, this is an interesting question. And I'm not sure that it's one that I can answer fully. I can tell you, I can sort of give you what I think the options are. You're correct that Colby, who is JJ's adopted brother, would have been the closest next of kin. And in fact, Tylee's remains were released to him. I do not know at this point whether JJ's remains were released to Kay and Larry because Colby agreed they should be, or because Kay was Charles Vallow's next of kin and executor of his estate. So I don't know for sure. I would like to think that Colby and Kay and Larry were communicating and that the decision was made amongst them. I hope that's what happened. But I don't know. I wasn't privy to that decision, and I haven't felt like I wanted to ask that question of Kay and Larry. I just don't think it's a fair question. They have, over the years, opened their lives and their hearts to the public in ways that I don't think anyone could have ever anticipated. But I do think that they're due some respect in some areas, and I think that that's one of them. I do know that JJ was his body was cremated, and I have not heard whether or not there will be any services. Oh, what's the bobblehead behind me on the shelf? You'll see, first of all, I love cats. And for a long time, people would give me cats. So all my cats are in my office. At one point, we had my daughter, who also loves cats. We decorated her bathroom in the house in all her cat stuff. But so I have quite a few different cats there. But the what are they called? Whatever they are. That is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I will grab it and share it. My kids started collecting a few of these. My daughter has a whole collection of the characters from The Office. But this is my spirit animal, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her husband were the keynote speakers at my law school graduation. It was about 4 months. She was still on the DC circuit. It was about 4 months before she was elevated to the Supreme Court. So, and they were a hoot. I'm telling you what, the two of them were like, it was almost like a stand-up routine. They were funny and engaging, and she had a lot of really important things to say about the role of women in the law. That was in 1992. And for the first time in my law school's history, there were as many women in the class as men. There was a 50-50 or 51-49 split in the class, but that was a first. Before that, there had always been fewer women in the classes. So, and Justice Ginsburg was a huge proponent of equal rights for women, and if you haven't seen On the Basis of Sex, which is the movie about her arguments before the Supreme Court, it's worth a watch. So she's here. She's my little spirit animal. A good friend, family member of mine, actually, about the time that she made the Supreme Court, as she was elevated in the Supreme Court, and the family member had been at my law school graduation. She sent me a replica of one of Judge Ginsburg's collars that she always wore with her robe. So I have that. It's a collectible piece too. Hi, Mary Howard. How are you? I hope the weather is better where you are in Washington than it is where I am, because it's snowing again. I was out shoveling the walkway earlier today. My neighbor and I were sharing duties shoveling. Those of you who have known me for a while know my husband's a little handicapped, and by all of his years of flying high-power jets, and so he's not really able to get out and do that. So I was out doing it. I hate it. I'm ready to move back to Arizona, but what the heck, we're here. So I hope the weather's much better where you are up in Washington. What do I know about the judge that's connected to the Murdaughs? So here, she is a very interesting woman. She's 80 years old. She was one of the first women who was elected to the state legislature in South Carolina. And she went from the legislature to the Court of Appeals, which is kind of strange. Often we see judges that they go to the circuit court judge, they become trial level judges, and then they get elevated to the court. But she went directly from the legislature to the court. Everything I've heard about her is she is a really smart woman. She has always been right on top of things. She is one of those judges who reads everything and is very deeply prepared. And she has been around the state a long time, and she has a lot of history with a lot of the influential people in the state legislatures, prosecutors, the Murdaughs. South Carolina bar is is a fairly small community, as it is in a lot of states, and people get to know one another. And so a lot of people who are in the know down there say that they think that Judge Toll is going to be that her getting on the case is a good thing. But there are people who also have reservations. I understand that her courtroom demeanor is pretty brusque, and she is not shy about dressing people down in court. I don't like that. I don't see any reason why a judge has to. It was described as pee in every corner of their courtroom. They have to exercise their dominion over their courtroom and the decisions that are made there. And I don't know why judges have to be that way. It makes sometimes a really unpleasant environment. Now, believe me, there are times that lawyers deserve to get dressed down. And if that's the case, then I think that the judge has every right to do that. But I think that a wise judge will do that in private. Will call the lawyer into his office and say, we need to have a conversation about the way that you conducted this, or the way that you conducted yourself, or I'm concerned about you're walking the ethical tightrope, those kind of comments. But you don't do that in front of a lawyer's client or their peers. So there are people that have reservations about her because she tends to be one of those sort of old school judges that are willing to take anybody in her courtroom to task. I don't know how that plays out for Dick Harpootlian. I think that from what I've heard, people who practice there say he would have never gotten away with pointing a gun at the prosecutor during the trial. He would have never gotten away with some of the antics that he did during the trial. So, it could be a double-edged sword. I don't know for sure, but I'm encouraged by the fact that what I'm hearing is that there are more people who are saying, no, this could be a good thing. She's very no nonsense. Judge Newman is very patient, and he lets the lawyers run their trial. I think when you have an appellate level judge, appeals run differently than trial courts, and appellate judges are expected to ask questions and to pose hypotheticals and to get the lawyers to explain their legal positions and their opinions. And it's much more of a give and take conversation in an appeals court. And so I think she may approach the courtroom a little more like that, and maybe be a little bit more directive about, I don't want you to talk about this. I want you to talk about that. But I don't know. I think that remains to be seen. So good question, Mary. What else you got for me? Chez la Mère, a little late for the line. So this question is out of order. That's okay. We can hold more than one thing in our heads. But how does anyone actually even know if Pryor even got his own DNA expert? I'm sure it must cost $$ to get this so-called expert. We do know because the expert, defendants and prosecutors are both required to disclose their expert witness list prior to trial. And so when we thought the trials were going to happen together in April, John Pryor had already provided a preliminary expert list to the prosecution and the judge. And there is a well-known DNA expert on his witness list. I'd have to go back through my notes and look to find his name, but he's a professor who teaches DNA and biogenetics and all of that stuff. So I know there is an expert, and he was identified. In fact, he was interviewed earlier in the life of the case by several YouTube channels, and he may have even been interviewed by Hidden True Crime. I don't remember for sure, but he was. I saw interviews with him in the run-up to the trial. So good question, though, and it's one of those things you don't do trial by ambush in criminal law, so they had to make all those disclosures. Hey, Squeaky Wheel. The more I hear about Donna Adelson, the more I wonder why she wasn't prosecuted before Charlie was. I can't wait to hear her jailhouse calls with Harvey after her arrest. Well, I don't know. I don't know if that was a tactical decision on their part. I don't know if perhaps they hoped that if they arrested Charlie, he would roll, or they hoped that he would make a deal to protect her. So I don't know if that was part of the tactical, sort of the reasoning in the way that they decided to run the case. But I absolutely agree that Donna Adelson is absolutely in the thick of it all, and really was the matriarch who was running the show. I think there are some fascinating parallels between the Adelsons and the Piketon massacre, because that also was a grandmother who was going to exercise control over her grandchildren at any cost. So those are interesting cases. Does anyone have an update on the Daybell siblings? Mary, we don't. The Daybell siblings have really gone out of their way to stay out of the limelight. We do know from Tammy Daybell's sister, who gave a victim statement at Lori's sentencing, that the children have sort of cut themselves off a bit from the family, and that they are from Tammy's family. And I think that's unfortunate, but we know that they're not having a lot of contact with Tammy's family. I've also heard, but things that are unsubstantiated, that they may not all be in lockstep about who's supporting their dad and who's not. And I think that can change. I think that they've had to take a real hard look at what they learned at Lori's trial, and to try and I'm sorry, I just saw a comment from Mary Howard answering my snow comment. So I think they have tried very hard to fly under the radar. I think you can, if you remember early on, the eldest daughter, Emma, was giving the media a hard time and making faces at them and flipping them off, and expressing her frustration with the media being around. And I don't think that played very well. And so I think since then, they've all tried to keep pretty low profiles. I understand that the Daybell family may not, it isn't entirely in lockstep either. I think that Chad's siblings are a little bit more reticent to get involved and to support him, the same way that Lori's family, the Cox family, has sort of taken a step back and is sort of stepping back from their sort of unequivocal support. I don't know. I mean, I think that it's a natural desire on the part of a child to want to support their parent. And I think that it's natural for children to want to think the best of their parents. It's hard for kids to come to the realization that their parents may not be the people that they thought they were. And those are all difficult conversations and difficult things to think about. And they take time to process. So I don't know about Chad's kids. I think that they're as much victims as anybody else. Chad's kids, Colby, they're all victims. And they've all experienced tremendous loss because of the choices that their parents made. Hey, squeaky wheel. Oh, Delphi. In the Delphi debacle, do you think it's likely Judge Gold will be kept on, that both attorneys will be replaced, or that all of the above will happen? Not going to hold you to it. So I think it's interesting that the Supreme Court accepted their motions and set a hearing on the issues. Supreme Courts love to send things back to lower courts. They love to say, it's not ripe yet. You don't have jurisdiction. Oh no, you can't come to the Supreme Court. They love turning away cases. And in any given year, something like between 1% and 5% of all cases ever make it to the Supreme Court, or ever actually arguments are heard. Often what happens is they're decided on the briefs, on the pleadings. That's called affirmed without appeal. And it happens all the time. You go to all the trouble of making an appeal, and you do all the work, and you file all the briefs, and the appellate court says, no, we don't need to hear argument on this. We're just going to affirm the lower court without writing an opinion. And so there you are. They've said, they've spoken. You're stuck with the lower court's decision, but there's no reasoning, there's no order, there's no argument. And that happens a lot in appellate work. So yeah, they call that AWOP, affirmed without opinion. And it happens a lot. So the fact that the Indiana Supreme Court set an expedited hearing to hear argument, I think is a good sign for the defense. I think that it's very possible that the Supreme Court may say, you need to reinstate his attorneys, Judge Gull needs to be out, and we need to set an evidentiary hearing on the motions that they filed, the underlying motions that were to throw out the search warrants and the warrants in the case. So remember that this shitstorm all got started because the defense attorneys filed a motion attacking the probable cause for the underlying warrants for Richard Allen. And in the process of that, filed this 139-page brief that explained their argument. That's where all the argument came, that there were alternate theories of the case that they didn't inform, that the state did not inform the court of. And so that's what led to them saying, we want the indictment thrown out. And the way we throw out the indictment is to say that all of the warrants that made all of the evidence available should be quashed. And if those warrants go, then they have to start from square one. If they're going to go back and go after Richard Allen, they have to go back to square one as if Richard Allen had never been arrested. So I think that it's very encouraging for the defense that the Supreme Court not only set an expedited hearing, but scheduled oral arguments. It means that they have questions that they want to have answered. So that's good news for them. Good questions, guys. Hi, Carol Renner. Can't the Attorney General investigate the Murdaugh team jurors to see if the jurors were told to lie after the verdict and all the bank accounts if they were paid? Well, I don't think it's the place of the Attorney General to do that. The Attorney General would be the agency that would make a decision about prosecution. But the investigation, and I mean, they could say to South Carolina law enforcement, SLED, we want you to investigate this case. That happens all the time. But they wouldn't actually be the agency that would do the investigation. It would be a law enforcement branch, and the Attorney General, their law enforcement branch is the state police, the SLED in this case. So that would be sort of the protocol, would be that law enforcement would investigate, and law enforcement would collect all that information. I mean, they would collect all the information about the emails and the bank accounts and all those sorts of things, talk to witnesses, file police reports with witness statements. They would turn all that over to the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General, the same way you would do in a local prosecution, would decide whether or not to file the charges. So typically what happens, let's say in Meridian, Idaho, where I live, if there's a crime that occurs, Meridian police go out, they investigate the case, they write a police report, they send all that information to the district attorney, and then the district attorney decides if there's enough information to bring charges. If the DA wants more information, you might refer it back to the agency and say, hey, you need to go out and re-interview this witness, or you need to go out and interview somebody this witness mentioned, or you need to go out and get the Ring camera doorbell from the neighbor, or the video footage from the convenience store, or whatever, and bring that back to me, and then I'll consider the charges. So that's kind of the way the process works. And so that would be the way the process would work at the state level as well. And so SLED has said they have opened an investigation, 2 investigations, in fact. And so they're going to collect all that information and then they'll present it to the Attorney General. So good question, though. Hi, Rachel Gamber. Is there anything in law that takes into account likelihood of reoffense? For example, especially, I don't know, it's likely Gypsy's ex will reoffend versus Alec Murdaugh, very likely. Yeah, one of the reasons why judges ask for a pre-sentence investigation is a pre-sentence investigation looks at the whole picture. They look at the person's criminal history, what their history has been in the past. They look at the nature of the crimes. They look at the severity of the crime in terms of how long did this go on? How long, in the case of Alec Murdaugh, I mean, he was bilking people for years, and many, many different people. And the victims were all very vulnerable people who'd been in accidents or who'd lost loved ones in accidents. They were vulnerable victims. So, so I think that's where the judge gets that information, is there's a pre-sentence investigation done. Now, part of what happens in a PSI is they look at mental health records. They usually do a mental health assessment, and they also apply these measuring scales to the case. And they're a way of attempting to quantify the possibility of recidivism. So there are some tests, some mental health instruments that are given that and are put into a formula along with the person's criminal history, the severity of the crimes. It's sort of like a long formula that results in some forecasts being made about the possibility of recidivism. They are not super reliable. I think they've been refined over the years as they've added more data, because they're definitely driven by past results, by comparing, a person in this situation with a person who is in a similar situation. Did that person reoffend? And so it's done a lot on statistical analysis more than solid data and inferences. They're not super reliable, but they do sort of give the judge I don't know, maybe a measuring stick. And different judges give those instruments different weight. So there are some ways to assess that. Not super reliable, but they're out there. And they do apply them in pre-sentence investigations. It's really up to the judge how much weight they give them. Sue Lambert, congratulations. I can hardly wait to pre-order. Are you going to autograph books that are ordered? I can hardly wait to read your book. I am going to sign books. I'm also, when we go to CRIMECON, we're going to be taking pre-orders. So I will be giving out book labels, because we won't have books to sign, but I'll be giving out autographed book labels that you can put in your book when it comes, and for anybody who's ordered. And we're going to be handing out swag and meeting lots of people. So I hope this is a plug for CRIMECON. It is in Nashville, and it starts on March 30th. I'm sorry, May 30th. It's over the Memorial Day weekend. So May 30th through June 1st. And one thing I want folks to know is that CRIMECON uses many, many volunteers. Every year, the crowds at CRIMECON get bigger and bigger, and the venues get bigger and bigger. And it takes an army of people just directing traffic and telling people what room to go to, and trying to sort out the schedules. And it's very simple work, but necessary. And that work's all done by volunteers. And what you get if you volunteer is a ticket. So if you have any interest in going to Nashville, and but you're looking at the cost and going, wow, that's daunting, think about volunteering, because that could substantially save you some money. We also are going to be reaching out to CRIMECON and as an exhibitor, asking for them to provide our followers with a discount. So we're still working on that, and that's a level of negotiation we haven't gotten to yet. But I hope that you all will think about coming. Wristbands are still available. All you have to do is send me a stamped, self-addressed stamped envelope to the address you see on the screen. And we still need to flood social media with pictures of those wristbands for Chad's trial. So if you haven't gotten one, or if you've worn yours out, just drop me an envelope and I will get one to you. I admit that I have not been down to the P.O. box since before Christmas because it's snowing out there, and I haven't really wanted to go driving around the last week or so, but we'll get there. Absolutely great to wear to CRIMECON. We'll have some at CRIMECON and be handing them out. I guarantee if you don't have one, come to CRIMECON and you'll get one. We've just hit the 2-hour mark, And so I want to thank everybody for being here. If we didn't get to your questions, please drop them in the comments below. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, drop me an email. That email address is in our show notes. But please drop me a note, because I like to answer questions. I just don't get to all of them these days because you guys have so many good questions. So I just want to say thanks for joining us again. Thank you for all your sweet well wishes for the book. I appreciate it. The timeline for the book is that we will start pre-sales the end of June, or the end of May, 1st of June at CRIMECON. Pre-sales will go until the book hits the shelves, and we are expecting the release to happen in September, and we're going to have a party. And I hope you will all join us. We're going to have an online party. So thank you all for being with me. Thanks to Jen for keeping things rolling. And until next week, I will see you, and have a great week, everybody.